We're back with our team of former federal prosecutors, Andrew Weissmann, Barbara McQuade, and Amy Lee Copeland. Let's listen to what Donald Trump just said about District Attorney Fani Willis in an interview that was released tonight.
Horrible district attorney from just a little while ago, from essentially Atlanta, that's Fulton County. She said, basically, I don't have any right to challenge an election. The district attorney, Fani Willis, in Atlanta, she's getting killed. Basically, she's saying Trump doesn't have the right to criticize an election.
Amy Lee Copeland, is that what District Attorney Willis is saying?
That's not what she's saying, Lawrence. She is saying that I have a statutory duty to review cases to determine if there is probable cause. If I think there is, I take it before a grand jury. And if a grand jury finds probable cause, then I seek an indictment. That's what she's done here. She did this both at the regular grand jury stage, but even before then, she got a special purpose grand jury. So no one could claim that this was rushed. That special purpose grand jury heard 75 witnesses and considered documents over the course of months. So Mr. Trump has gotten twice as many procedural protections as most criminal defendants have. She doesn't decide whether or not he gets indicted. That's in the hands of ordinary citizens who step up and perform their duties. Of all the states, only about 22 actually require grand juries for felony indictments. It's different in the federal system, but the states, about half of them require grand juries. Georgia's one of those states. Mr. Trump was afforded the process that he's entitled to. And again, he got about twice as much process as most criminal defendants.
Andrew Weissmann, your reaction to what we just heard Donald Trump say?
I think I'd like to step back and talk about the complicity of certain parts of the media with Donald Trump. The Alvin Bragg case is really about the confluence of the National Enquirer and Trump in terms of keeping information from the public. The Dominion voting case was where they won their suit was about Fox News being complicit with in order to increase their share of clicks and viewers with Trump and his allies. I saw it in the Mueller investigation. There was constant communication between Paul Manafort and Sean Hannity while he was out on bail with a restriction to not have those communications. And this is obviously what Donald Trump said, as Amy said, is just not true. I mean, it is factually false. And it is the kind of thing that should be challenged by somebody who is actually a member of the news media, as opposed to some kind of, public figure or news figure, but not a journalist. And that is a real problem in terms of doling out to Republicans this idea that Donald Trump is being prosecuted simply because he challenged an election. Well, he challenged an election in over 60 courts. He had his day in court repeatedly, and he lost all of that. So no one has denied him that. It is that he then took the law into his own hands. That is what he is charged with. And he will also have his day in court as a criminal defendant to challenge the government's proof on those issues like any other defendant.
Barbara McQuade, I know there are people in the audience wondering, where is the line? What is the limit of what Donald Trump can say about District Attorney Willis? And the conditions of his release include what he cannot say to or about witnesses, include what he cannot say to co-defendants. But there's nothing in there about what he can say about the prosecutor. However, there is that condition that Donald Trump and Rudolph Giuliani have in their release that says they can't do anything to otherwise obstruct the administration of justice. And so, at what point does lying about the district attorney become an effort to obstruct the administration of justice?
Yeah, I think one of the things that both Fani Willis and the judge here are trying to navigate is a person's genuine free speech rights to criticize elected officials and those presiding over a trial and acting on behalf of the government with actually disrupting the trial and making things difficult, poisoning the jury pool, for example. I think on some of those, vaguer kinds of things, they're going to give him a fair amount of leash. There's also a condition in there that he may not violate any state or federal laws. And so to the extent there is a threat, there is a call for harm, I think we could see a revocation of the bond there. But simply, criticizing her, saying she's, bad at her job, or that this is all about his questioning of the trial, I think they're going to give him a long leash on those kinds of statements.